sure there must be some mistake, isn't there? Tonight, me, audience, the panel. Who is this person? But maybe I'm not unique. Have you not looked into the mirror and wondered sometimes who is the image staring back at you? Perhaps a life is made up of very many lifetimes, and we just don't know what the next one's going to bring. Where does this all start, you might ask? My case, privileged background, wanting for nothing, career paths almost laid out for me. What could have possibly gone wrong? Until it did. In my case, two momentous events that weren't supposed to have occurred. But then we're not wired up expecting the worst. How could we be? If we knew what was round the corner, would we be able to cope? I doubt it. So the response in my case, which I've had every justification for feeling, was blame. What did I do to deserve what was happening? The problem is allowing oneself to be consumed by the unknown. It can have very, very long-reaching detrimental effects. Look at the other broader picture, the broader question. Not coincidental, the Holocaust Memorial Day was last week. It's like questioning the existence of the divine who allowed the innocent to suffer while the wicked seem to get away scot-free. How can that be right? Or is it perhaps our lack of understanding that enables it to appear that way? The question is how to move on. Hillel's famous adage comes to mind. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I am for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? What does that mean? If I'm not for myself? Does that mean get a grip, take responsibility, wise up, a little unkind when you've gone through some type of very traumatic experience? Surely that can't be the first stage. The first stage surely has to have making some type of pact with the unknown. And then if the first stage is self-preservation, shouldn't that come with a health warning? If it becomes an end in itself rather than a stage in a process? Perhaps it would be a good idea, just to take an example. Take someone whose response to adversity was perhaps being in the world of business and suddenly abandons everything with all the benefits and stability that accrued for a literary career and the uncertainty that went with it. Maybe for some self-esteem that had never been reached or fulfilled. How would we look upon such an individual? Deluded, irresponsible, or both? I see a few people shaking their heads. Or maybe, instead, in a recovery mode from a traumatic experience, at the end of which a new version of that person might evolve with a new set of priorities. The problem is balance. Not easy when things are so raw and everything in the past would remind that person of adversity, or even worse, be linked to it. But of course, the answer, as always, is timing. Time is a great healer, as they say. And in time, that individual might be able to look more objectively on what happened and extract the good, and may even be able to benevolently look upon the aloofness of those people who regarded his metamorphosis as some type of mental aberration, or else coming across the elusive pot of gold. The fact that there's some truth in the latter, our individual probably hasn't reached the stage where he's acknowledged it. Before that, How would his higher level of consciousness manifest itself? Probably in writing books where the characters he invented were purely an attempt to come to terms with an identity of himself. And then, as one book followed upon another, he might start to query, was there something other than the driving force behind this? Perhaps he'd even start querying how the perception of himself differed from where he was now. In other words, he hadn't acknowledged the role of potential in life. Not very encouraging if you don't know what it is, you might say. But how could it be otherwise? If we knew what we were capable of, wouldn't it prevent us from striving further? Strangely, the acknowledgement of what his abilities were, or not knowing what they were, made it easier to come to terms with the bigger questions in life for which there are no answers. In fact, the unbridgeable gap between what he knew he was capable of and those which he still wasn't were no longer a problem. In fact, it was a comfort. He had a comfort in not knowing because he had everything that he needed. And he was quite happy to put it to the side. Perhaps even so, he might have connected unwittingly with the spiritual side and maybe part of a religion, call it Jewish religion, that he had no real prior connection to apart from a functionary observance that had more to do with appeasing his family when he was younger rather than perhaps a search for a life of purpose and meaning. But now, all of a sudden, there seemed to be a momentum to discover it further. And how would he do that? Well, there's only certain much he could do on his own. But then surely, perhaps he would have to find a group of teachers who wouldn't frown upon his elevated thoughts, but actually might help harness them within the permitted boundaries of the text that they were studying. Yes, you're right. I mean, someone, possibly. But of course, even they would know that's only half the story. The other half, to stop it from being purely an academic exercise, is to put those practices, religious practices, which are the cornerstone of religion, as part of his existence, part of his life. The difference here is now that he was able to personalize what he learned, it would be far more sustainable than hitherto. So now he's able to embrace his Jewish identity. He's probably answered Hillel's second point. If I'm not for myself, what am I? There's still some way to go. What was he going to do with everything that he learned? And as for Hillel's last challenge is, if not now, when? It suddenly occurred upon him that the insight that he developed, albeit belatedly, was no different from any other resources he's been bestowed with, that they weren't his exclusive domain. Now he knew the way forward. He could make his story more relatable to his personal experience. I am that writer, no surprises there. Jacob Returns provided me with the means to be able to convey and share my personal pot of gold.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm actually going to speak sitting down. My sincere apologies for my lateness. I sat on a train stationary for an hour a little earlier. I was supposed to be here, there was a fire near the Seven Tunnels, so I got stuck somewhere. Don't ask. I'm delighted to have got here. Apologies for the disruption of my arrival. I'm very grateful to John for asking me to share some thoughts about a very specific aspect of his work. From a traditional perspective, how does Jewish thought, tradition, process the ideas of doubt and uncertainty? You know, the first religious questioner was probably Abraham, and he begins challenging God over his intention to destroy the cities of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah. And his question, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice, implies there are questions one may ask, and you may have the courage to ask them before God. But ultimately, there must be certainty somewhere. But that certainty may lie only in the mind of God. And in fact, the rabbis frame it. They say, Ein Sofik Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the divine world, there is no doubt. But human beings are not beyond doubt. And in fact, understanding that there is doubt, that most of our thinking, practice, and in fact our lives exist in a kind of blurry grey, rather than attempting to push them into a black and white, is a key feature of the human experience. Jewish law, very briefly, talks about doubt from multiple perspectives, pages and pages. When I was in Shiva a long time ago and starting to be a rabbi, we spent the most enormous amount of time discussing how various types of doubt are processed and what to do in circumstances of doubt. Doubts, rabbinic doubts, biblical doubts, double doubts, triple doubts, all kinds of doubts, because Jewish law has a grammar of uncertainty. It's not embarrassed by complexity. It doesn't pretend it doesn't exist. And halakhic doubt, in the legal sense, is really trying to decide what to do when life isn't certain. We're more interested beginning to focus on Jacob in something which one of my favorite thinkers, a really radical, disruptive thinker from the early 19th century, the Rebbe of Izhbitz, is interested in. What does it mean to live in a meaningful relationship with the divine when certainty simply isn't available, where the clarity that was mentioned in the introduction isn't possible? This is where Jacob's return becomes so resonant. It moves from the fantasy that everything can be resolved to the discovery that a truthful life requires one to live in a world where not everything can be resolved. At the beginning, Maurice Barnett represents the belief that in principle you can master everything. For Maurice Barnett, it is on page 1, John. There were no unresolvable questions, just a deficiency of knowledge to determine their answers. This is almost the opposite of embracing doubt. It begins in uncertainty, but it doesn't end there. Indeed, the rabbi I was referring to, he is very fond of Abraham as his, if you like, model figure. Why? Because Abraham lives in a world of uncertainty. He's told he will have descendants, yet he's told to kill his son. How does he work when there is existential uncertainty? He knows the moral seriousness of murder, but is confronted with a divine that seems to demand it nonetheless. The real test for Abraham, according to this radical reinterpretation, is that he doesn't resolve the doubt in a self-seeking way. He doesn't use his love of Isaac as a pretext for dismissing the divine command, but instead he passes the test because not everything is clear. He remains loyal even though he cannot achieve certainty about some of the most interesting things in life. And other figures who seem to seek certainty, particularly the Jacob of the Bible, my friend the Ishbitzer likes much less. And ultimately, John's novella moves in more of an Ishbitz direction. Gradually, Maurice begins to realize in his conversations with the therapist that life is not so straightforward. As the therapist says, it might have just been just enough to sow a seed of doubt. The salient point is that he felt the need to share that uncertainty with his public. He begins to realize that doubt cannot be resolved. It's not a problem. It's something one might need to acknowledge, embrace, and even hand onto others. And in fact, that transformation that happens through the novel, the characters realize that one cannot control the world. There's no final theory that embraces everything. And one will have to develop, if one is to have a happy life, a meaningful life, an authentic life, the ability to live with what one cannot fully command or predict. And in that regard, very near the end, perhaps the final line I'm going to quote expresses this most clearly. Surely life's greatest gift was that of not knowing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's what is supposed to resonate, hopefully of Jacob, is the acknowledgement of not knowing. And not, as we start off in the novel or novella, but it's a side of weakness. We think that doubt is a sign of weakness, but it isn't. It's an acknowledgement there's something more important than us, not important than us, at a higher level than us. In other words, I would have thought that if we think that we should understand everything, we've certainly missed the point. And I think that's what is supposed to resonate out of Jacob is that very point, that acknowledgement of not knowing gives you a chance to move on. You can have a much better idea of who you are, and much more point of what you're not. And once you've got that, it will give, I believe, a person a much greater peace of mind than being out, than the levels of number of disappointments that one would come across because we think we have all the answers. As I say in my discourse, we don't expect the worst to happen. We're not geared up for that way. So it's much better that we have to deal with that if we have to, as and when it happens at all.
It doesn't matter. I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Patricia Pitchon. I worked for many years as a journalist and translator, and I also trained as a psychotherapist. I worked as a psychotherapist about 20 years and retired at the end of COVID, although I still continue to write articles. My contribution tonight is a sort of pondering about the relationship between the main character, Jacob, and the man who becomes his therapist. And that story of the dialogue between them is sort of woven throughout the whole novella in one way or another. And it's interesting in the sense that it's a difficult task for the therapist to become his therapist because he's an old friend of Jacob's father, who's the one that's died. And Jacob has left Ireland, where he was born and raised by a single mother, to London to go to the funeral of a father he's never left. The mother and the father had an affair when this lady was very young. Then she returned to Ireland and had this child as a single parent. So the boy was brought up with the idea that the father never cared, mostly gave a bit of money now and again, but never really made any effort to meet him. So when he comes to London, apparently he has inherited a house and some money. And he goes to the funeral. Later on, the lawyer reads out the will, and the will turns out has left him a house in Hampstead and some money. But the most important thing there is that very gradually, throughout this exchange with the therapist, the boy starts to ponder, who was this father really? He starts to find out that he was quite a famous, well-established professor of philosophy at one of the universities in London, that he was quite a character, he had a strong personality, and that he had many admirers among his students, because what he was teaching was basically that you should meet life on an individual basis with confidence, and that you as a person, you have a choice at any time to do what you would like to do or want to pursue, and that you should not be dependent on some divine power to establish all this for you. He was obviously a sort of diehard atheist, but the young people liked this idea of thinking about the power of choice, and that was what was important for this philosopher to teach. So Jacob, when he first meets this friend of his father, he meets him because he sees him at the funeral, and the chap has delivered a eulogy talking about the father. And when he meets him, he starts to see, the chap tells him, well, come in. And he goes in to the house of the therapist, and he sees a whole lot of books of Jung and Freud and so on. So he starts to question him, are you a medic of some sort? And he said, no, I'm a psychotherapist. And they start to talk. And Jacob says, well, I've always wondered what it would be like to be seated here with some fellow like you. I suppose it's because you learn more about yourself. What makes you do certain things? That's what you do, isn't it? And the therapist replies, it's more about dealing with deep-seated problems of identity. And Jacob answers, shouldn't imagine there's any shortage of takers. He has this kind of quite forward and somewhat cheeky personality. Um, and then he wonders about his father and says, well, it's all the more intriguing, wouldn't you say? Meaning finding out more of about his father in that sort of way. So the therapist comments that Jacob must have had a special relationship with Morris Barnett. And it's only then that the therapist realizes he's talking to the son, who has never, in fact, met the father. But later admits that the father was sometimes supported by sending a bit of money to the mother. And then he says at another point, when this therapist kindly invites him to stay as a lodger for a short while until he settles what he's going to be doing, whether staying in London or going back to Ireland or whatever, he then explains that he has inherited this house and maybe some money, so he's going to actually stay in London for a while longer. Sort of, it suddenly becomes a different approach to life. So he decides to stay and eventually gets a job as a journalist and offers a series on his father to a newspaper, and starts to think about maybe staying in London. The most interesting thing at this point is that he starts to develop a more thoughtful persona, not just because he's in therapy, but because he starts to have a relationship with this father who has in fact died, but he suddenly acknowledges as part of himself in some way, even though he never met him personally. He inherits a load of albums and letters, and he starts to go through these things and realizes that the father has a background of a family who was very academic from Germany, and suddenly this whole panorama opens up about where he comes from that side of his identity. So in effect, his therapy slowly becomes a search for his identity that extends into this unknown father that then suddenly becomes much more real to him. So this is a very interesting aspect of the therapy. The other thing that's interesting is that the boy does not know that this therapist actually knew the father far better than just a casual acquaintance. So the therapist has to be very careful and walk a sort of tightrope, not revealing much of himself at all, but encouraging the boy to reveal whatever he wants to reveal. And it's a very difficult balancing act, which he seems to manage. I think what's very interesting is that when the boy finally comes to see this whole cache of letters, he realizes that the father has written a load of letters to him over the years, which the mother has never opened. So in this cache are all these unopened letters to him. And although the author doesn't go deeply into what these letters are, it's very clear by implication that suddenly this is another rich opportunity to establish some kind of a relationship with this father who did in fact try to get in touch with him many times. And that changes his view, which looking back, he thinks was bitter and maybe shallow as well. But the thing about this story that I liked was that from an unpromising background of a woman who had to bring up a child on her own in Ireland with an Irish Catholic family, and then he had this father with a completely different cultural heritage who was just a cipher for him for a long time. What happens later when he manages to find out more is that some bridge is established, and that permits him to have a more hopeful outlook on life. It actually does him a power of good to make the effort to establish and find out more about that side of his family. So there is that theme running through this, which I think is a very enriching read. I enjoyed it myself. I did. So that's my contribution.
Okay. I talked in my discourse about the three parts of Hillel. If I'm not for myself, who's going to be for me? If I'm myself, what am I? Really, the novella is split into three parts. Jacob returns a double entendre. Nitsa, Metz, and Teshuva. Well, that's part of it. Although Jacob doesn't know he's not a Jew at that stage what Teshuva is. But it's really about taking responsibility. As I said in my discourse, how long are you going to be able to blame someone or something for adversity? Adversity is a theme that runs through most of my books, particularly this one. It's how we respond to it. And Jacob understands, because he's been deprived, he thinks, of an identity because of his father, he's blaming the whole world until he finds out that's not actually true. And then decides how, uses the friendship she develops with a therapist to find out more about himself. That's okay. But then he's got to do something with it. What's he going to do with his new identity? It's about action. It's all very well coming to peace and coming to terms with everything that's happened in the past and from an adversity point of view. But you've actually got to try and make a difference. And these are the three stages of the novella: coming to terms with what happened in the past, moving on, accepting what you're doing, and then trying to make a difference. And that's why the strapline of this book is the Hillel statement, which is what I base my discourse on. Very much three parts about eventually taking responsibility, if one possibly can, understanding and putting onto one side those things you can't possibly understand, but don't treat it as a weakness. It's probably a strength. And using that, the difference between what you're capable of and what you know is beyond your reach, to gain some type of spirituality. And I think that's what Jacob's done, and it's probably a mirror of my own journey.
Right, okay. This is going to seem like a step into another direction altogether. In 1937, the very popular composer George Gershwin passed away. Arnold Schoenberg, at the absolute other extreme of the music spectrum, the intellectual 12-tone music composer, wrote an obituary. And in that obituary, he wrote something crucial about the artistic process. And I think that will help us understand John's writing, Jacob Returns, and several other books by John. Schoenberg wrote that an artist is like a tree which produces fruit. The fruit is the art form. The artist does not have control over the fruit that he produces, but it's truly the fruit of his or her tree, his or her being. So I would like to touch on an element in John's thinking and being, which comes up again and again in his work, considering several of his books, and that is the hiddenness of Judaism and Jewishness. Jacob is not halachically Jewish. His father is, but not his mother. His father, Morris Barnett, who we posthumously get to know in the book, was renowned, as we heard from Patsy, as a rationalist philosopher, excluding any kind of spirituality. But at the last stage of his life, controversially, he changed his perspective, which causes great upset in his university department. Now, in Morris Barnett's background, we're shown a glimpse of what might be real Judaism. An old photo of religious-looking Jewish men, for example. I think it's mentioned twice in the book. But when Morris Barnett makes his crucial about turn, which is so controversial, he doesn't come back to or forward to Jewish observance. As far as we can see, he doesn't put on tefillin, nor keep Shabbat, nor start eating kosher. Instead, He writes in his final controversial magnum opus about the presence of a higher power. This means, although there is a higher power, he admits that, but Judaism remains hidden. Now, in John's essay, Finding Your Own Way, which he's given us a little abstract earlier today, which is a kind of explanation of what Jacob Returns is really about, John is a little bit more explicit. He admits to his own, quote, stricter adherence to the 613 commandments, mitzvot, number 4. In fact, John may look normal, but, but he's actually a very observant Jew with regular Torah study sessions, including the subtleties of Talmud. I find this contrast quite intriguing. Only in John's first novel, Shimon, do we meet fully confessing Jews and Judaism. But here too, there's progress. It's not static Judaism. Set in Roman Israel, Shimon is a detailed elaboration of a Talmudic story about the one-time gladiator who becomes a famous rabbi named Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, and his eventual brother-in-law, Rabbi Yochanan, who brings him to Jewish practice and advanced study. That's in Shimon. But in John's other works, Blue Skies Over Berlin, 3 Days in Vienna, Nadine, Temple of Fortune, in all of these, Judaism is present, peeping from the wings, but very rarely center stage. Sometimes it's seen when someone dies, and there's the Jewish funeral. Sometimes it's there in a painting of children setting off in a Kindertransport journey from Vienna to London. True, each book has a strong Jewish historical or cultural dimension, trying to catch Nazis selling off valuable art treasures stolen from Jews in Blue Skies Over Berlin, battling a former Nazi pharmaceutical company which stole medical patents from Jews and is trying to market them as its own, 3 Days in Vienna, dealing with nasty English old boy businessmen who drive a lovable Jewish property developer to the ground, Temple of Fortune. But where is actual Judaism? Sometimes it appears veiled and in French, as in the case of Nadine. Nadine's mother was Jewish and was hidden in a convent in France during the war. Her beautiful daughter Nadine, a wonderful dancer, performs in London and meets the Jewish producer Peter Greenberg. He suddenly remembers it's his father's 60th birthday, and very unwillingly, he takes her to his parents' home in, quote, North London. Where could that be? There she meets his very Jewish family. Peter Greenberg is embarrassed by them and later is shocked to hear that she liked them. Quote, "You're not telling me that you actually liked them," says Greenberg. Nadine answers, "I'm an only child. It was very different in my home. I never had the closeness that you have in your family. It's because you're Jewish, no?" "What's that got to do with it?" asks Greenberg. "I am Juive, aussi," Nadine announced. But Greenberg didn't hear, end of quote. We note that her admission to being Jewish is in French, and anyway, Greenberg didn't hear. It's like a game of hide and seek. One is reminded of the story of the Baal Shem Tov, who met a little boy who was crying. "Why are you crying?" asked the Baal Shem Tov. The boy said, "Because we were playing hide and seek. Then it was my turn to hide, but my friends didn't come to look for me. They just played by themselves." God says the same thing said the Baal Shem Tov. God hides the inner point of Jewishness within each Jew, also hides, barely daring to express itself. I think this might be John's comment on the Jewish community in which he was brought up and the, quote, normal state of Anglo-Jewish society today. But it may not be consciously so. Like the fruit of the tree described by Arnold Schoenberg, this may well be the way John's literary artistic impulse expresses itself. It is what it is, but must it always be so? My question to John is, what is the next step? How does the inner point of Jewishness get fully revealed? Is that possible? And perhaps that's also a question to each of us here today.
Thank you, Tali. I think that all the books, actually, they're all novels up to the stage of Jacob, were a search for identity through adversity. I think the difference with Jacob is that trying to answer Hillel's last statement, if not now, when? I needed to try and make a difference. I needed to try and make a difference of the spiritual journey that I'd been along since I started writing in around 2005, 6, and 7, to make it more relatable. That's what I needed to do in order to be able to say in my discourse, all the insight that I've gleaned, all the learning, life experience, etc., was not mine, not my exclusive domain. It was to be like the rest of our resources, to be shared. And so Jacob is much more relatable to my own experience, and it's the first real level of coming to terms with who he is from a spiritual point of view, but it's only the first book of which there'll be, all being well, a second one to follow shortly, and a third, which will be higher levels of spirituality that hopefully will reflect my own personal journey. The first one, the first book is told through literature. It's an allegory through literature. The second one, which is being edited at the moment, is through art. And the highest level of the third one, all being well, will be through music. All similar stories, but at a higher level of awareness, spiritual awareness, and Jewish awareness. I think, yeah.
So if any of you have any questions for any members of the panel about the book.
Have you read it is not a permitted question.
For John Steinberg, did you have any interest in writing when you were younger? And would you have liked to have started writing earlier than you did?
The answer to that question is definitely no. I had no academic ability at all in terms of writing. It's something that I never thought I could do, which makes the whole process much more interesting. If you don't know what your abilities are, if you don't know what your potential is, how can you possibly query the bigger questions in life? And this is the whole point. This is what I'm trying to convey. There's so much that one doesn't know about oneself. How on earth can you query anything of a higher nature, a higher level? We learn new things about ourselves all the time. I said writing was never, ever on the agenda, never. And now it's an important part, it's a central part of what I'm trying to do. I don't know, I have no idea where it came from. Even now, when I finish and look at a book and I thought, who did that? Who wrote it? It's a mystery. But if it's a mystery, if we don't know what we can do, isn't that encouraging? I think it's extremely encouraging. We don't know what our potential is. That's the whole point. And if we don't know what our potential is and what we're capable of, how can we query anything of a higher nature? It doesn't make any sense.
I think there was some. I'm a bit slightly hard of hearing, so there were some bits that I missed. How did you start? If you take yourself back 20 years, I don't know how many years, 10 years, 20, 30 years, what were you doing then before you started all this?
I was in business, remained in business while I continued to start writing, but I realized that I could actually do something that I didn't think I was able to do. And I started, I think, in 2005, writing a few lines. I'd already been always interested in humor. So I started writing a few lines, and one thing led to another. And I realized I felt good. I felt good about something that I was able to make my own, what I was able to personalize. And actually, I didn't know that at the time, but that's got some spiritual analogies as well. The more one can personalize and make it your own, a far much better chance you can be able to sustain what you've taken to yourself and hopefully to pass on to the next generation. Too early in the secular world that I grew up in. It's a dogmatic approach where you hit over the head, this is what you've got to do, this is what and it doesn't work. Doesn't work without any reason behind it. Be able to intellectualize what you're doing, not just being told and cascaded with a stick. So the writing process and the spiritual journey worked hand in hand.
And so that you were in business before you started this, but
I was in business to start before I started this project, but it wasn't given up just overnight. They ran in parallel for a while, and then till I was able to concentrate mainly on writing.
Could you give us a short description, or even a long description, if you wish, of what you were doing when you were a child of 10, 12, 15, 20?
Try the short version. Yeah, would that be okay for everyone?
A short description. Nothing particular. As I say, I had a privileged upbringing, went to very good schooling, wanted absolutely for nothing, had a career path almost laid out, following previous family members of a family business, etc. Nothing could possibly go wrong. And it didn't. For a long time, it didn't go wrong.
So where was the Jewish connection? How did that come about?
I had a traditional upbringing, Jewish upbringing, but it was one of, I think you said, a not practicing Orthodox upbringing, going to shul 2 or 3 times a year, aware of one's Jewishness, but nothing more than perfunctory observance, as I said in my discourse, for the appeasement of my parents, rather than for a search for a life of spiritual meaning. And something which obviously, when adversity happened, wasn't able to be sustained, which is why I said in the discourse, when these 2 momentous events happened, the first thing I did was to establish blame for something which I couldn't understand.
And presumably you had brothers, sisters? What were your brothers and sisters' connection or reaction to that?
I have a question about the mother in the story, who I'd like to ask both of you really, who has withheld the letters from her son. And so the search for his identity comes later. But what sort of blame are you attaching, if any, to the mother for hiding where he has come from through the father?
Sorry, Jacob would blame his mother a lot. He was living in England at that stage, except she had dementia and therefore wouldn't be able to have a proper conversation with him. But as he moves on and finds his own identity through his deceased father, he manages to, the blame disappears. He's prepared, at the end of the book, to go back, revisit his past, objectively extract the good from the, as I said in my discourse. Maybe his mother wasn't capable of doing anything else. After all, the father left her with a young child. She had to bring him up on his own. She probably had, from her perspective, every reason to feel resentful. But Jacob, because he's moved on in his own life, is now more understanding. And whereas he wouldn't when he arrived at the beginning of the book, if he'd known the truth, would have reacted completely in a different way. Because he's moved on and found out who he really was and was at peace with himself, he could go back and not hold any resentment against his mother, which he would not have been capable of doing earlier on.
Use the mic.
I agree with John over this in the sense that there's a couple of things there. Is developing dementia time he goes to London. So he has this choice. Does he go back and reminisce, or does he go back and tell his mother off, or what? And there's a conversation with the therapist in the book where the therapist to attempt something like that with someone who has already started to develop dementia. But he also finds the inner strength not to be bitter at this point. And this has a lot to do with recovering this aspect of himself, that the father attempted to contact him, that there's a rich background there, that he starts to develop that side of himself. So there's more magnanimity in his attitude, which is entirely convincing, the way that it's presented. And he spares the mother. He visits her, he goes and sees her, and she's in a special kind of care home by that time. But she gives him a faint smile of recognition, which in himself is sort of enough for him. And that's how that is presented very delicately in the book. It's a nice question.
Hello. My question is to the, sorry, I didn't catch your name, the therapist lady.
Patsy.
Patsy. The relationship between Jacob and the therapist, was it one of a friend, patient, or was the therapist acting as a mentor?
This is a very good question, because this is the question that confronted the therapist. What am I going to do with this young man? I've offered him to stay a few days. Now I discover that he might be staying longer in London, and well, eventually he moves and starts to work, gets a job. And the therapist from the very beginning is quite boundaried. The boy wants to have a friend, and he tries to explain to him that under the circumstances, if he ever really does want therapy, then he can't do that. He has to have a boundary. He can't be his friend. He can't tell him things about himself. Oh, well, how can I proceed if I don't know anything about you? He says at some point in the book. And the therapist answers, the whole point of therapy is that it's about, he implies it's about you. It's not about me, the therapy. That's what I can do. But it was very diffident and delicate, this kind of tightrope walk to begin with. Eventually, the thing does develop basically as patient-therapist relationship, although for a time, it rests more like therapeutic conversation, and then eventually does become patient and therapist, especially when he moves out and starts to develop some work and so on. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm married to a therapist.
Who isn't?
Any other questions?
Just one question, John. You have a history of writing with humor, about humor, and in the humorous mode. Yet this book particularly doesn't have any of that context in it. Do you feel that religion would allow you to bring the humorous writing that you have done into this world.
Well, I hope that there was some amusing comments between Jacob and the therapist, and I think that religion certainly needs some type of humour to bring it along. I mean, it's I hope it's not as dry as you're insinuating, because there are, I think, some humorous moments with Jacob and the therapist.
Very much so, yes.
I think so, but I think you're also giving some tips for the next one.
It needs to be fun. It needs to be funnier, doesn't it? Okay.
I'm intrigued about the next one because you said you're going to use the lens of art and then music. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
It's three mediums which are very dear. I mean, literary, obviously, as a writer, art is also of a personal interest, and music was actually an interest before any of these two beginning. And I thought if I could tell stories through those particular medium, it would be an interesting. I think they would resonate. And as I say, that the literature, being Jacob, is the first medium, art the second one, which can have a greater appeal, but music has the greatest appeal of all. And that's the point. Music has potentially a greater reach than anybody, which is not coincidental. Why it happens to be, if I can get round to it, the third book.
No more questions. Thank you. Just a couple of things, because I'm always in awe of people that can be creative and have that outlet. We're doing a really nice walk and write course coming up, so using the local area and then coming and writing, as well as a whole host of art classes and other ways. So I just wanted to point that out for those of you that have sort of a creative block and want to look at different ways. Do check out our programme. John, do you want to explain, because there are some lovely books outside, what you would like to do with those?
Number of books outside. Please feel free to say, if you haven't already got one, please take one. They're for your enjoyment. Hope that they resonate with you. They're not I'm not charging for them. So please, if you haven't read the book and you'd like to, there are plenty. I think there are 20 on the table outside. Some of which are signed, some of which are dated, and I might have forgotten some altogether, but I'm not really sure. But please help yourself.
We will do it then on a sort of first come, first served basis, because there's a lot more than 20 of you. But do speak to John and we can perhaps look at ways of getting books to you, or share and pass it on.
No other questions at all?
Available on Amazon.
I don't believe so. Thank you very much to this incredibly esteemed panel. Thank you. Absolutely. Safe journeys onwards, and we hope to see you at JW3 again. There is a form that we'd like you to fill out, so please do fill that out, and thank you very much. No, I don't.